For years, the Luftwaffe laughed. They stood on the airfield tarmacs of occupied Europe, binoculars pressed to their faces, and watched with a mix of contempt and amusement as massive box formations of American B-17s droned overhead. The flying fortresses looked unstoppable, hundreds of silver bombers blotting out the sun. But what came next was almost always the same: chaos. Bomb bay doors yawned open, thousands of pounds of explosives tumbled earthward, and then nothing. Fields erupted in useless plumes of dirt, forests burned. Quiet villages miles from the intended targets were reduced to rubble. The factories, the oil refineries, the rail yards, the arteries of the German war machine stood almost untouched. German officers sneered and sipped their coffee as they watched another mission fail to do real damage. They called it Stahlregen, ohne Gehirn, steel rain without a brain. Strategic bombing, they concluded, was a foolish dream. Precision from 20,000 feet? Impossible. The Americans were wasting their time, their men, and their machines. But in 1944, the laughter stopped. The same bombers that had once scattered their payloads across the countryside were now striking with unnerving accuracy. The same formations that once seemed like blunt instruments of destruction had become scalpels. The same air war that once looked like a costly sideshow was now the decisive front of the conflict. America's bombers weren't dropping bombs anymore. They were performing surgery. And the patient was Nazi Germany. Before the war, the very idea of precision bombing was considered little more than a fantasy. In the 1930s, most military planners, especially in Europe, saw air power as a support tool, not a war-winning weapon. The Germans were masters of tactical air power. Dive bombers like the Ju-87 Stuka screamed down on enemy lines with terrifying precision, clearing the way for the Blitzkrieg's tanks and infantry. To them, aircraft were flying artillery, mobile, fast, and devastating in direct support of ground troops. The Americans, however, dreamed bigger. The U.S. Army Air Corps believed that wars could be won from the sky alone. Why slog through trenches or storm beaches when you could destroy the enemy's factories, oil, transportation, and morale from 20,000 feet up? If you could cut off the flow of fuel, weapons, and supplies, the enemy's armies would collapse without a single shot fired on the ground. The key to this vision was a piece of technology that on paper promised miracles: the Norden bomb sight. Developed in the 1930s, it was touted as a revolutionary optical computer that could guide bombs with near-pinpoint accuracy. American commanders boasted that it could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. It was so secret that bombardiers were sworn to protect it with their lives. If they were shot down, they were ordered to destroy it immediately rather than let it fall into enemy hands. But reality had other plans. At altitude, the bomb site's theoretical precision meant little. Winds buffeted bombers off course. Anti-aircraft flak forced them to maneuver. Cloud cover obscured targets. Crews were inexperienced. Even when everything went perfectly, the margin of error was massive. Early bombing runs routinely missed their targets by more than a mile. The statistics were damning. During some raids, fewer than 10% of bombs fell within 1,000 feet of their target. Entire industrial complexes remained untouched while thousands of tons of high explosives were wasted on empty fields. Ball-bearing plants, essential to the German war effort, were barely scratched. Oil refineries continued producing. Rail yards hummed with activity. The Luftwaffe's mocking wasn't just arrogance. It was grounded in cold, hard fact. Then came the disasters of 1942 and 1943. The U.S. 8th Air Force, based in Britain, launched a series of bold daylight bombing raids deep into German territory. They believed that flying in tight formations would allow their bombers to defend themselves without fighter escorts, and that daylight would allow for the precision the Norden promised. It was a brutal miscalculation. The twin raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, key centers of Germany's ball-bearing production, were supposed to cripple the Reich's war machine. Instead, they became cautionary tales. Out of 376 bombers that took part in the first Schweinfurt raid, 60 were shot down and over 100 were damaged beyond repair. Crews that survived returned with horror stories of relentless fighter attacks and deadly flak. And the damage? Minimal. German production quickly recovered, and the Luftwaffe's factories kept churning out aircraft. The Luftwaffe's confidence soared. They concluded that the Americans would never be able to cripple Germany's industrial heartland from the air. Strategic bombing, they believed, was a dead-end strategy, costly, ineffective, and doomed to fail. They were about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The Americans didn't give up. Instead, they adapted. They studied their failures, dissected every mission, and began rewriting the rulebook of aerial warfare. Precision bombing, they realized, wasn't a fantasy. It was a science, and science could be improved. First came better training. Bombardiers learned to read winds, calculate drift, and adjust for flak bursts. Formation flying improved, allowing bombers to deliver concentrated firepower and mutual defense. Then came the game changer: long-range escort fighters. The introduction of the P-51 Mustang meant that bomber formations could now be protected all the way to their targets and back. The Luftwaffe's once deadly interception tactics became far less effective. Technology evolved too. Pathfinder aircraft equipped with radar could now guide formations to their targets even through thick cloud cover. Aerial reconnaissance improved target intelligence dramatically, allowing for more accurate mission planning. By 1944, the 8th Air Force wasn't just dropping bombs, it was executing calculated strikes against the very core of the Nazi war machine. And nowhere was that transformation more devastating than in Germany's most vulnerable lifeline: synthetic fuel. Germany's Achilles heel was oil. Unlike the United States or the Soviet Union, the Reich had no significant natural petroleum reserves. Instead, it relied on an ingenious but vulnerable solution: synthetic fuel plants. These massive industrial complexes used coal and hydrogenation to produce aviation gasoline, diesel, and lubricants, everything the Wehrmacht needed to keep its planes flying, tanks rolling, and U-boats prowling the Atlantic. Without synthetic fuel, the Luftwaffe would be grounded. Panzers would become immobile steel coffins. Trucks would sit abandoned by the roadside. Even Hitler's grand offensives would grind to a halt before they began. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, later admitted that if the Allies ever succeeded in destroying Germany's synthetic fuel supply, the war would be over within months. The Americans knew it too. By early 1944, intelligence reports and captured documents confirmed what Allied planners had long suspected. Synthetic fuel was the beating heart of Germany's war effort. And so, in one of the most important strategic shifts of the entire conflict, the U.S. made these plants priority number one. In May 1944, the Allies unleashed the campaign that would break the back of the German war machine. The first major precision raids targeted the synthetic fuel plants at Leuna, Böhlen, and Politz, vast industrial complexes that fed the Reich's insatiable hunger for oil. These weren't random bombing runs. They were meticulously planned strikes, guided by reconnaissance photos, weather data, and new tactics honed through painful trial and error. When the bombers arrived over the targets, the Luftwaffe expected the same clumsy show they'd seen so many times before. They expected the bombs to fall wide, to crater harmless countryside, to scorch the ground but spare the machinery. They were wrong. This time, the explosions were different. They weren't scattered across empty fields. They were concentrated with surgical precision. Cracking towers vanished in towering orange fireballs. Hydrogenation units buckled and collapsed under the weight of direct hits. Pipelines burst, sending geysers of flame into the sky. The plants that once powered Hitler's armies were reduced to smoking skeletons of twisted steel and molten concrete. German intelligence officers were stunned. Reports poured in describing devastation far beyond anything they had anticipated. One Luftwaffe commander, upon inspecting the ruins, reportedly muttered, "They have found our heart." Another wrote bitterly, "Our Air Force was grounded not by pilots, but by engineers." The impact was immediate and catastrophic. Within weeks, Germany's aviation fuel production dropped by nearly 90%. Entire regions of the Reich were suddenly starved of fuel. The Luftwaffe, once a fearsome threat that had ruled the skies over Europe, found itself unable to even take off. Germany scrambled to respond. The stakes were existential. Without fuel, the war could not continue. The Nazi regime threw every resource it had into defending the synthetic fuel plants. Flak towers bristled around the complexes, filling the skies with a deadly curtain of any aircraft fire. Camouflage nets and false buildings were erected to confuse Allied pilots. Dummy plants were built miles away to lure bombers off course. But nothing worked. By 1944, the Americans had mastered the art of precision bombing. Radar-guided Pathfinder aircraft pierced through camouflage. Reconnaissance flights identified decoys before missions even began. Formation tactics allowed bombers to push through even the densest flak barrages. And as the months went on, the accuracy only improved. The Germans tried another desperate measure: production dispersal. They scattered fuel production into smaller facilities, hoping that no single raid could cripple them. But dispersal meant inefficiency. Smaller plants couldn't match the scale of the original complexes, and many were hastily constructed, vulnerable to even minor attacks. Fighter production, too, surged in a last-ditch effort to regain control of the skies. But the cruel irony was that even as new aircraft rolled off assembly lines, there was no fuel to train pilots, no fuel to conduct missions, no fuel even to fly them to the front. Luftwaffe squadrons that had once terrorized Allied bombers now sat idle on the tarmac, their pilots reduced to helpless spectators. The effects rippled far beyond the skies. Tanks, once the spearhead of the Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg tactics, were abandoned on roadsides for lack of gasoline. Trucks were converted to run on wood gas, a desperate and inefficient solution that barely kept supply lines crawling. Entire divisions were immobilized, their fighting strength sapped not by enemy fire but by empty fuel tanks. The Reich was choking. By the autumn of 1944, the scale of the crisis was undeniable. Germany's war machine, once the most formidable in the world, was grinding to a halt. The consequences of the oil campaign touched every branch of the Wehrmacht. The once feared U-boat fleet, which had hunted Allied convoys across the Atlantic, was now limited to a fraction of its previous patrols. Panzer divisions were rationed fuel so severely that they could move only when absolutely necessary, and even then, often only for a few miles. The Luftwaffe was perhaps the most visible casualty. In 1940, it had swept aside Allied air forces with terrifying ease. By late 1944, its presence over Europe was a shadow of what it once was. Entire training programs were suspended because there was no aviation fuel to fly sorties. Rookie pilots, rushed into combat with only a handful of flight hours, were slaughtered by veteran Allied aviators. The once proud Air Force that had bombed London and Moscow into submission was now powerless to stop the relentless destruction raining down on Germany itself. The fuel shortage didn't just weaken Germany's defenses, it crippled its ability to wage offensive war. Plans for major operations were delayed or canceled outright. The most dramatic example came in December 1944 when Hitler launched his final gamble, the Ardennes Offensive, better known as the Battle of the Bulge. The plan was ambitious, a surprise winter counterattack through the Ardennes that would split Allied lines, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. But the operation was delayed repeatedly, not because of weather or logistics, but because there simply wasn't enough gasoline to fuel the tanks. Even when the offensive finally began, German units were forced to advance with dangerously low fuel reserves. Many panzers were abandoned in the forest, not destroyed by enemy fire, but left behind when their fuel tanks ran dry. Albert Speer, reflecting on the campaign years later, admitted that the Allied precision bombing campaign against synthetic fuel won the war faster than any army. The Luftwaffe's arrogance, their sneering dismissal of American bombing raids as steel rain without a brain, had been turned on its head. The very weapon they mocked had become the one that destroyed them. The transformation of the American bombing campaign from blunt force carpet bombing to surgical precision was more than just a tactical success. It was a revolution in the art of war. The lessons learned over Germany in 1944 would shape military strategy for the rest of the century. After the war, air forces around the world built their doctrines around the principle that precision, not volume, wins wars. In Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, and beyond, air campaigns focused on key nodes, command centers, supply lines, fuel depots, the same critical arteries the Americans had targeted in 1944. Smart bombs, laser guidance, and satellite targeting would eventually make the dream of the Norden bomb site a reality. But the foundation of that revolution was laid in the skies over Germany. The story of the strategic bombing campaign is one of arrogance and reckoning, of ridicule transformed into fear, and of a weapon dismissed as useless becoming decisive. The Luftwaffe laughed as American bombers scattered their bombs across empty fields. They laughed as raids failed, as factories kept running, as the Reich's war machine roared forward. But in 1944, they stopped laughing, because the Americans stopped missing. And when they did, the war was lost. Not on the ground, not in the trenches, but from 20,000 feet above, where engineers and aviators changed the course of history with every bomb they dropped. By the winter of 1944, the air over Germany told a story more devastating than any battle map could. Contrails crisscrossed the sky in thick white veins, stretching from the English coast deep into the Reich. Once these trails had symbolized futility, Bombs dropped at random, war material wasted, crews slaughtered for no gain. Now they symbolized inevitability. Each line in the sky pointed toward a target that would not survive the day. The Luftwaffe had all but ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The few fighters that rose to challenge the American formations were outnumbered, outgunned, and often flown by boys barely out of flight school. Ammunition shortages forced pilots to ration their fire. Even when they managed to shoot down a bomber, the loss was meaningless. Hundreds more followed behind. The vast industrial heart of the Reich was now naked and exposed beneath a relentless aerial assault. Factories once thought invulnerable were now priority targets. Ball-bearing plants, long a source of frustration for Allied planners, were reduced to rubble. Transportation networks, rail yards, bridges, marshalling yards were systematically dismantled, choking the flow of supplies. The once proud German war economy was being hollowed out piece by piece, its beating heart silenced by precision and persistence. The psychological toll was just as severe. Cities that had survived earlier raids with only minor damage now endured weekly strikes that crippled their industries. Workers walked miles to factories that no longer had power. Train lines that once delivered coal and ore were now twisted wreckage. Civilian morale, once bolstered by propaganda promising invincibility, began to crack under the strain of relentless bombing and economic collapse. The Allies understood that they had achieved something far more powerful than simple destruction. They had forced Germany into a reactive posture. Instead of dictating the tempo of the war, the Reich was now scrambling to repair, rebuild, and reorganize, all while under constant attack. Hitler's grand strategic ambitions were now irrelevant. The war's course was being dictated from the skies. As 1945 dawned, the destruction of Germany's synthetic fuel network was complete. What little production remained was so limited that it barely met civilian needs, let alone military demands. Speer described the situation in grim detail. Every military decision, every operational plan was now subject to the question of fuel. We could build tanks, but we could not move them. We could train pilots, but they could not fly. We could build submarines, but they could not patrol. The Luftwaffe's last desperate innovations, jet fighters like the Me-262 and rocket interceptors like the Me-163, arrived too late and without the fuel to make an impact. On paper, these revolutionary aircraft could have changed the course of the air war. In reality, they sat grounded. Their engines starved of the synthetic fuel they needed. Even when they did take to the skies, they were too few and too late to turn the tide. On the ground, the Wehrmacht faced the same paralysis. The mobility that had defined German warfare in 1939 and 1940 was gone. Tanks that had once roared across Europe now sat abandoned, their crews forced to fight on foot. Supply convoys slowed to a crawl, leaving frontline units undersupplied and vulnerable. Strategic reserves of fuel were depleted so badly that some divisions resorted to siphoning gasoline from civilian vehicles. It was a humiliating collapse for a military machine once considered unstoppable. The irony was brutal. At the start of the war, Germany had mocked America's faith in strategic bombing as naive. Now that very strategy had become the decisive factor in its defeat. What tanks, artillery, and infantry could not achieve on the Eastern Front or in the hedgerows of France, precision bombing had accomplished from miles above. This transformation did not happen overnight. It was the product of relentless innovation, painful lessons, and an unwavering belief that air power could be more than just a blunt instrument. The Americans had turned their bombers from scattershot bludgeons into surgical scalpels, and with each successful strike, they reshaped the very nature of modern warfare. In many ways, the synthetic fuel campaign marked the birth of a new era, one in which wars would be won not just by armies clashing on battlefields, but by the calculated destruction of an enemy's ability to wage war in the first place. It was a lesson that would echo far beyond 1945. The legacy of that campaign was immediate. In the post-war years, military planners around the world studied the oil campaign with a mixture of awe and respect. The conclusion was clear. Control of the air meant control of the war. Future conflicts would see air power used not just to support ground forces, but to paralyze entire nations. During the Korean War, American bombers targeted power plants, rail hubs, and supply depots, lessons learned from the destruction of Germany's oil network. In Vietnam, despite the difficulties of jungle warfare, strategic bombing campaigns sought to isolate the enemy by destroying logistical networks. And in the Gulf War of 1991, Precision-guided munitions, the technological descendants of the Norden bomb site, devastated Iraq's infrastructure in a matter of days, achieving effects that once required months of sustained bombing. The psychological dimension of strategic bombing also evolved. The shock and awe campaigns of the late 20th and early 21st centuries drew directly from the lessons of 1944, the understanding that breaking an enemy's will often begins with breaking its industrial backbone. The image of bombs striking key targets with surgical precision became not just a military tactic, but a symbol of technological dominance. Yet for all its success, the story of the American bombing campaign is also one of transformation, a journey from hubris to humility, from overconfidence to mastery. It began with a promise that technology alone could win wars, a promise quickly shattered by reality. It stumbled through humiliating defeats and catastrophic losses. And it ended with one of the most decisive strategic victories in military history, a victory that crippled a nation not by conquering its armies, but by starving them before they could even fight. The Luftwaffe, once so sure of its superiority, had underestimated its enemy. It had mocked the Americans for their naivety, dismissed their strategy as folly, and believed itself untouchable. But war has a way of punishing arrogance. And in 1944, the punishment came not in the form of tanks or infantry, but in the cold, calculated precision of bombs falling from the stratosphere. The same commanders who once laughed at the Americans now watched helplessly as their aircraft rusted on runways and their tanks became monuments to a vanished army. The same industrialists who once boasted of Germany's unstoppable war machine now stared at empty fuel tanks and silent assembly lines. And the same Reich that once dreamed of world domination now faced inevitable defeat, not because of a single battle lost, but because the sky itself had turned against them. By the time Allied troops crossed the Rhine in early 1945, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The German army, battered and immobile, could not stop them. The Luftwaffe could not challenge their advance. The Reich's vast industrial machine, the heart of its war effort, was shattered beyond repair. What began as ridicule had ended in ruin. And so the story of strategic bombing in World War II is not just a story about technology or tactics. It's a story about belief. Belief in an idea so audacious that even its creators doubted it could work. It's a story about perseverance in the face of failure, about refusing to abandon a vision when the world says it's impossible. Most of all, it's a story about transformation, the transformation of a strategy, of a military, and ultimately, of the war itself. By early 1945, Germany was fighting a war it could no longer sustain. The grand visions of conquest that had fueled the Third Reich in the late 1930s had withered into desperate attempts at survival. Every decision made in Hitler's bunker, every plan drawn up by the Wehrmacht's general staff was now dictated by a single, suffocating constraint: fuel. It was the invisible enemy, the silent saboteur. The Allies hadn't just bombed Germany's factories, they had bombed its very capacity to fight. Across the Reich, the evidence of collapse was everywhere. Luftwaffe bases that had once roared with the thunder of engines now lay eerily quiet. Rows of aircraft sat grounded, their sleek fuselages gathering dust. Many of them had never flown a combat mission. They were simply waiting for fuel that would never come. Pilots, once the pride of the nation, now spent their days drilling on the ground. Some even reassigned to infantry units because their aircraft could no longer be used. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army's relentless advance exploited this weakness mercilessly. Soviet armor surged westward, encountering German tank divisions that were tanks in name only, units with more steel than gasoline. Entire formations were left behind, unable to retreat or reposition. What fuel remained was hoarded for the most desperate counterattacks, leaving vast swathes of the front line effectively paralyzed. In the West, the situation was no better. As American and British forces crossed the Rhine, German commanders faced an impossible choice: commit their last fuel reserves to defend the river line, or save them for a final defense of the homeland. Many chose the former, and by the time the Allies reached the heart of Germany, there was little left with which to resist. Even the vaunted armored divisions, once the cutting edge of blitzkrieg, were shadows of their former selves. Tanks that had once spearheaded lightning offensives now crawled forward at walking speed, their movements dictated not by strategy, but by the availability of a few precious gallons. Maintenance crews began cannibalizing entire vehicles for fuel, siphoning what they could from abandoned wrecks. Some commanders resorted to using horses to tow artillery, a bitter return to the methods of World War I. The civilian economy suffered just as deeply. Transportation networks broke down under the strain of fuel shortages. Trains ran less frequently or stopped altogether, leaving critical resources stranded. Coal, vital for heating and industry, piled up at mines because there were no locomotives to move it. Agricultural shipments rotted in warehouses, unable to reach the cities. Starvation loomed in urban centers that had once been fed by an efficient railway system. For ordinary Germans, the war's consequences were no longer abstract. They were visible in every empty fuel station, every coal department, every abandoned truck rusting on the side of the road. The regime's propaganda machine continued to promise victory, but few believed it. The sense of inevitability, the creeping realization that defeat was no longer a possibility but a certainty, began to spread. The destruction of the synthetic fuel network didn't just weaken Germany militarily. It unraveled the very fabric of its wartime society. Without fuel, factories couldn't run. Without factories, weapons couldn't be built. Without weapons, armies couldn't fight. It was a chain reaction, one carefully engineered from 20,000 feet above the ground. One of the most remarkable aspects of the oil campaign was its efficiency. For all the massive resources poured into strategic bombing, the results far exceeded the investment. The Allies didn't need to bomb every tank or plane. They didn't need to destroy every factory. They only needed to target the small number of facilities that produced the fuel those machines depended on. This concept, destroying a critical node rather than the entire system, would become a cornerstone of modern military strategy. It proved that the quickest way to defeat an enemy wasn't always by meeting them head-on, but by cutting off the lifelines that sustained them. In Germany's case, those lifelines were the synthetic fuel plants that had once seemed too large, too hardened, too vital to be vulnerable. By the time the Luftwaffe realized just how vulnerable they were, it was too late. It also revealed the limitations of even the most powerful armies. The Wehrmacht was still formidable in 1944, well-trained, well-equipped, and deeply entrenched. But all the training and weaponry in the world meant nothing without the logistical backbone to support them. When the oil stopped flowing, the army stopped moving. The notion that wars are won by logistics rather than battles was never more true than in the skies over Germany. As the Allies advanced deeper into the Reich in early 1945, they began to see the full extent of their success. Reconnaissance photos revealed synthetic fuel plants reduced to fields of rubble. Massive refineries, once humming with activity, were now silent wastelands, their machinery twisted beyond repair. Entire industrial towns had been effectively erased from the map. Captured German documents told the same story. Internal reports described fuel reserves measured in days, not weeks. Memo after memo warned that entire air fleets could no longer operate. Some commanders begged for operations to be postponed until more fuel could be produced, pleas that were ignored because there was no way to produce it. Even Hitler, whose delusions of victory had once seemed boundless, raged in private about the cowardice of the sky, a bitter acknowledgement that his empire was being destroyed from above. The final irony was that even as the Allies continued their bombing campaign in early 1945, much of it was no longer strictly necessary. The damage was already done. Germany's defeat was sealed long before its cities fell to invading armies. It was sealed in the destruction of a few dozen critical facilities the Luftwaffe had once dismissed as untouchable. Looking back, the strategic bombing campaign against Germany's fuel network was more than just a military operation. It was a demonstration of the evolving nature of war itself. In 1939, victory was measured by territory gained, cities captured, armies defeated. By 1945, it was measured by the destruction of infrastructure, supply chains, and industrial capacity. The shift was profound, and it would shape the conduct of wars for generations. The campaign also marked the maturation of American air power. What began as a bold but flawed theory in the 1930s, the belief that wars could be won from the air, had been vindicated. It wasn't easy, it wasn't cheap, but it worked. The bombers that once missed by miles were now instruments of precision, capable of dismantling an empire without ever setting foot on its soil. For the Luftwaffe, the lesson was bitter. They had believed that wars would always be decided by dogfights, tank battles, and infantry assaults. They were wrong. The war that destroyed them was fought not by soldiers in trenches or pilots in cockpits, but by engineers calculating trajectories, scientists improving bomb sites, and crews who refused to stop flying into the heart of enemy fire. By March 1945, the Reich was living on borrowed time. The once proud German war machine, which had thundered across Europe in the early years of the conflict, was now a hollow shell of its former self. Its armies still fought fiercely, often with fanatical determination, but they fought without the mobility, flexibility, or firepower that had once defined them. They were static, reactive, and exhausted. And the reason could be traced back to the smoking ruins of the synthetic fuel plants bombed months earlier. At Luftwaffe bases across the country, aircraft lined up neatly on runways and taxiways, dozens, sometimes hundreds of them. But most hadn't flown in weeks. Many would never fly again. Their fuel tanks were empty, their engines cold. The few that did make it into the air often did so for brief missions, limited by strict fuel rationing. Some pilots were ordered to cut their engines and glide part of the way home just to conserve fuel. It was an absurd situation for a nation that had once prided itself on its technological superiority in aviation. The fuel crisis also crippled Germany's ability to adapt. Late-war technological marvels like the Me-262 jet fighter and the V-2 rocket were impressive on paper, but their potential was never realized. The Me-262 in particular was a devastating interceptor, faster and more powerful than anything the Allies had in the sky. But without fuel for training, pilots could barely learn to fly it, let alone master its complex handling. Many crashed on takeoff or landing. The V-2, meanwhile, was an engineering triumph, but a strategic dead end. It required vast amounts of fuel to manufacture and deploy, and it offered no tactical advantage once the Allies were already deep inside German territory. The same story played out on the ground. Germany's armored divisions, once the spearhead of its offensives, had been reduced to glorified roadblocks. Tanks were dug into defensive positions and used as stationary artillery because there wasn't enough fuel to move them. Trucks, critical for transporting supplies and troops, were abandoned en masse. Horse-drawn wagons, a relic of the previous World War, once again became a common sight on German roads. Even the civilian sector had reached the breaking point. Public transportation collapsed under the strain of fuel shortages. Streetcars stopped running in major cities. Civilians resorted to bicycles, carts, or simply walking to work, if their workplaces were still operating at all. Factories that hadn't been destroyed by bombing were idle because they lacked raw materials or electricity, both of which depended on fuel-powered transport and power generation. Propaganda could no longer hide the reality. German newspapers, once filled with boasts of technological supremacy and inevitable victory, now spoke in grim tones of sacrifices and temporary difficulties. Radio broadcasts urged citizens to save every drop of fuel and warned against hoarding, a tacit admission that the nation's reserves were gone. People lined up for hours to receive rationed supplies, often only to find there was nothing left to distribute. The collapse of the fuel supply was more than just a logistical failure. It was a psychological one. It stripped away the illusion of invincibility that had sustained the German war effort for so long. Soldiers knew that reinforcements could not reach them. Civilians knew that factories could no longer produce the weapons that might turn the tide. Commanders knew that no matter how brilliant their strategies were on paper, they were meaningless without the fuel to execute them. The war was no longer about tactics or technology. It was about mathematics, about how many gallons of synthetic fuel could be squeezed from a crumbling industrial base, and the answer was always the same: not enough. By April, as Allied troops closed in on Berlin from both east and west, the air campaign that had begun with ridicule and doubt had achieved something extraordinary. It had done what no ground army could do. It had immobilized an empire. The Reich's capacity to fight had been hollowed out from within, its mighty military machine reduced to a brittle shell. The German High Command recognized the inevitability of defeat. Speer, who had overseen the nation's armaments production with ruthless efficiency, privately admitted that the destruction of the synthetic fuel network had made continued resistance mathematically impossible. Even Hitler, who raged at his generals and fantasized about miracle weapons that might still turn the tide, was forced to acknowledge the grim truth: the war was lost. But even in defeat, the lessons of the oil campaign continued to unfold. Allied intelligence teams, following close behind the advancing armies, were astonished by what they found. They walked through the ruins of Leuna and Pellets, through shattered pipelines and collapsed refining towers, and they realized just how effective their bombing had been. In many cases, a handful of well-placed hits had disabled entire complexes. Dozens of secondary industries had been crippled by the loss of a single critical facility. The scale of the destruction was greater than anyone had dared to hope. It wasn't just physical damage, it was systemic. Germany's wartime economy had been built on the assumption that its synthetic fuel network was untouchable. When that assumption proved false, the entire structure collapsed. The Reich had no plan B. There was no alternative source of fuel, no contingency plan for rebuilding under bombardment. The destruction of those plants wasn't just a blow to Germany's military. It was a death sentence for its entire war effort. In the final weeks of the war, the Allies continued their bombing campaign, but by then it was largely symbolic. There were few meaningful targets left to destroy. Germany's skies, once fiercely contested, were now virtually undefended. Bombers flew with impunity, sometimes without even needing fighter escorts. Cities were leveled, rail networks obliterated, and what remained of the industrial base was reduced to rubble. But these were finishing blows to an enemy already mortally wounded. When Germany finally surrendered on May 8, 1945, it did so not just because its cities were occupied or its armies defeated. It surrendered because the very machinery of war had ceased to function. The Luftwaffe couldn't fly. The Wehrmacht couldn't move. The factories couldn't produce. The Third Reich, for all its military might and industrial ambition, had been strangled by the quiet, methodical destruction of its fuel supply. And in that lies the true power of strategic bombing. It wasn't the bombs themselves that defeated Germany. It was what they targeted. It was the deliberate, calculated dismantling of the systems that allowed the Reich to wage war. It was the shift from brute force to precision, from indiscriminate destruction to targeted paralysis. It was the evolution of air power from a blunt instrument into a scalpel sharp enough to carve out the beating heart of an empire. The oil campaign of 1944 to 45 remains one of the most decisive and consequential operations in military history. It proved that wars could be won not just by destroying armies, but by destroying the means to sustain them. It showed that the key to victory often lies not in the battlefield, but in the factory, the refinery, and the transport hub. And it demonstrated, perhaps more clearly than any other campaign of the war, that arrogance is a dangerous illusion. The Luftwaffe mocked American bombers as clumsy and ineffective. They called strategic bombing a waste of time, a fool's dream. They believed themselves untouchable, but the very weapon they laughed at became the one that broke them. The skies they once ruled became the skies that doomed them, and the bombs they dismissed as random and aimless became the tools of their destruction. When the guns finally fell silent and the fires of war died down, the Allies didn't just stand among the ruins of the Third Reich. They stood at the dawn of a new age of warfare. The destruction of Germany's synthetic fuel network wasn't merely a victory, it was a revelation. It revealed something profound about the nature of modern conflict, that wars could be won without the annihilation of armies, without the occupation of capitals, and without the total destruction of a nation's people. They could be won by crippling the invisible arteries that sustained the war machine. This lesson would reverberate across military thinking for the next half-century. The campaigns of World War II had been a brutal proving ground for air power, its limitations, its failures, and ultimately, its extraordinary potential. The success of the oil campaign, more than any other operation, vindicated the pre-war theorists who had argued that strategic bombing could decide wars. It had taken years of trial and error, thousands of lives, and countless missions. But in the end, they had been right. The U.S. Army Air Forces emerged from the war not just as a crucial branch of the military, but as a central pillar of American power. No longer relegated to a supporting role, air power became a strategic tool in its own right, a weapon capable of shaping the course of global events. This transformation culminated in 1947 with the creation of the United States Air Force as an independent branch. Its founding doctrine was built on the lessons of World War II: control the skies, destroy the enemy's capacity to wage war, and victory will follow. In the early years of the Cold War, this doctrine evolved into something even more formidable. The nuclear age had dawned, and with it came a new understanding of strategic bombing. The same logic that had guided the attacks on Germany's oil plants now applied on an unprecedented scale. If you could destroy the enemy's command centers, infrastructure, and production capabilities, you could paralyze them without a conventional battle. Only now the tools were more powerful, and the stakes infinitely higher. But the lessons of 1944 were not lost amid the nuclear arms race. In fact, they became even more relevant. The idea of targeting critical infrastructure, the centers of gravity that kept an enemy functioning, remained central to strategic planning. It shaped the development of bombers like the B-52 Stratofortress, designed to penetrate deep into enemy territory and strike vital industrial and military targets. It influenced the design of missiles and satellites, systems that could deliver precision strikes from thousands of miles away. It also transformed how wars were fought below the nuclear threshold. In Korea, American bombers were used to cut supply lines and disrupt logistics, echoing the tactics that had crippled Germany. In Vietnam, the controversial Rolling Thunder campaign aimed to break North Vietnam's will by targeting transportation networks, power plants, and industrial centers, though with mixed success. And in later decades, conflicts in the Middle East and the Balkans would once again demonstrate the effectiveness of targeted strikes against key infrastructure. The Gulf War of 1991, in particular, was a direct descendant of the lessons learned over Germany. In the opening hours of Operation Desert Storm, American stealth bombers and cruise missiles struck Iraqi command bunkers, communications hubs, and power grids with astonishing accuracy. Within days, Saddam Hussein's regime was effectively blind and paralyzed, unable to coordinate its defenses or move its forces efficiently. The ground war that followed lasted just 100 hours. It was a textbook example of what had first been proven in 1944. Destroy the enemy's ability to sustain war, and the rest of the fight becomes almost irrelevant. The technological evolution that made such precision possible was staggering. The Norden bomb sight, once hailed as the pinnacle of accuracy, had been crude by comparison. Modern guided munitions could strike within meters of their targets from thousands of feet above the ground. Satellites provided real-time imagery of enemy infrastructure. Drones could loiter over a target for hours, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The dream of dropping a bomb into a pickle barrel, once an overconfident boast, had become an everyday reality. And yet, despite these advancements, the underlying principle remained the same. The lessons that the Luftwaffe had learned the hard way in 1944, that no army, no matter how powerful, could survive without its logistical lifelines, were as true in the 21st century as they had been in the mid-20th. Precision had simply made that truth more devastating. There was also a philosophical dimension to this evolution. Strategic bombing had once been seen as a blunt, indiscriminate instrument, a way to terrorize civilian populations and break their will. The early Allied bombing campaigns against German cities, for example, had caused immense destruction but questionable military results. But by the end of the war, the oil campaign had shown that strategic bombing didn't have to mean mass civilian casualties. By focusing on key industrial and logistical targets, it could achieve decisive results without the widespread slaughter that had characterized earlier raids. This shift laid the groundwork for modern doctrines of surgical strikes and collateral damage minimization. It influenced not only how wars were fought, but how they were justified politically and ethically. Precision wasn't just a matter of effectiveness, it was a matter of legitimacy. For Germany, the legacy of the oil campaign was bitter but undeniable. Post-war studies by both Allied and German analysts concluded that the destruction of the synthetic fuel network had been one of the single most decisive factors in the Reich's defeat. Albert Speer himself, in his memoirs, called it the war-winning campaign. He argued that had the Allies focused on fuel plants earlier, rather than scattering their efforts across a wide range of targets, the war might have ended a year sooner. German military historians agreed. Many pointed out that by late 1944, the Wehrmacht still fielded large, well-equipped armies and could have continued to resist for many more months. But without fuel, those armies were useless. They couldn't maneuver, couldn't counterattack, couldn't exploit breakthroughs. They could only fight where they stood, and that meant they could be surrounded, bypassed, or destroyed at the Allies' convenience. The oil campaign also forced a fundamental reevaluation of air defense strategy. The Luftwaffe's failure to protect critical infrastructure highlighted the need for integrated air defense systems, networks of radar, interceptors, and surface-to-air missiles designed to shield key targets from attack. This lesson would shape German military thinking for decades and influence the design of NATO's own air defense strategies during the Cold War. There was an even deeper lesson, one that transcended military doctrine. The fall of the Third Reich showed that industrial warfare was not just about weapons and soldiers. It was about resources, logistics, and the complex networks that sustained them. The Allied campaign against synthetic fuel wasn't glamorous. It didn't involve dramatic battles or famous generals. But it attacked the war machine where it was weakest, and that, more than anything else, brought the Reich to its knees. It also served as a warning for the future. Any nation that built its military power on fragile supply chains or vulnerable infrastructure was living on borrowed time. The United States and the Soviet Union both took this lesson to heart as they built their Cold War arsenals. They hardened their fuel networks, diversified their supply lines, and developed strategies to protect critical infrastructure from air attack. They understood that in the next war, if it ever came, the fight might be decided not on the battlefield, but in the skies far above it. The Luftwaffe's downfall was more than just a military defeat, it was a psychological reckoning. For years, German commanders had believed that air superiority was about dogfights and aircraft numbers. They had invested heavily in fighters and interceptors, convinced that as long as they could shoot down enemy bombers, their industrial heartland would remain safe. But the oil campaign revealed a brutal truth. It didn't matter how many bombers you shot down if even a fraction of them reached their targets. A single bomb dropped on the right piece of machinery could cripple an entire fuel plant. One successful raid could undo months of production. The scale of this vulnerability was something the Luftwaffe had never truly appreciated. In their arrogance, they had dismissed strategic bombing as ineffective because early raids had been inaccurate and disorganized. They had assumed that such results would never improve. This complacency was fatal. By the time they realized the Americans had solved the problem, with radar guidance, escort fighters, and new tactics, the damage was already beyond repair. In post-war interviews, many Luftwaffe officers spoke with a tone of bitter respect for the American campaign. General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most famous fighter aces, admitted that the destruction of the synthetic fuel industry was the decisive blow that made further resistance impossible. "We could replace pilots," he said. "We could build new aircraft, but we could not replace fuel." This realization reshaped the way every nation thought about air power. The focus shifted from purely defensive strategies, intercepting enemy bombers in the sky, to proactive ones that sought to protect vital infrastructure on the ground. Radar networks, early warning systems, and integrated air defense grids became the new front line. The old notion that the battlefield existed only where armies clashed dissolved. Now the battlefield was everywhere, in factories, in pipelines, in power plants. The American experience had its own transformative effect. The men who had once watched their bombs scatter uselessly across the countryside had, by 1945, become masters of their craft. Bomber crews who survived the war were some of the most highly trained aviators in history. Many went on to lead the new U.S. Air Force, bringing with them a doctrine that prioritized precision, intelligence, and strategic impact over sheer volume of firepower. This doctrine would shape not just American strategy but global military thinking. The Soviet Union, watching closely, invested heavily in strategic bombers and missile systems capable of striking the United States' industrial heartland. Britain and France built their own nuclear deterrents around long-range bombers and ballistic missiles. Air power had become more than a tool. It was now a primary means of deterrence, a way of shaping global politics without ever firing a shot. And the lessons of the oil campaign weren't confined to the military sphere. They permeated economics, engineering, and geopolitics. Nations realized that their infrastructure, the lifeblood of their economies and militaries, was far more vulnerable than they had assumed. This sparked massive investments in redundancy, decentralization, and protection. Fuel networks were dispersed and buried. Power grids were hardened. Transportation systems were designed with multiple contingencies. The aim was simple. Never again would a handful of well-placed bombs be allowed to bring a nation to its knees. Yet despite all these changes, the legacy of the oil campaign remained haunted by a paradox. The same technology that had allowed the Allies to cripple Germany also introduced a new vulnerability. If precision bombing could destroy a nation's capacity to wage war, then no nation, not even the United States, was safe. This realization ushered in an era of strategic anxiety. Governments built vast networks of early warning radars, interceptor squadrons, and missile defense systems, all designed to prevent a repeat of the devastation that had crippled Germany. It also fueled the nuclear arms race. If precision strikes on infrastructure could win a conventional war, nuclear weapons promised to end wars entirely by annihilating those targets in minutes rather than months. The logic of the oil campaign evolved into the logic of mutually assured destruction. The very success of strategic bombing had changed the stakes forever. Still, even as nuclear strategy dominated military planning, the principles proven in 1944 never lost their relevance. The Cold War saw numerous examples of wars and crises shaped by the same logic. During the Vietnam War, the U.S. targeted North Vietnam's power plants, bridges, and transportation networks in an attempt to force negotiations. In the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Israeli aircraft struck Egyptian and Syrian logistics hubs to halt their offensives. And in 1999, during NATO's intervention in Kosovo, precision airstrikes against Serbian infrastructure compelled Slobodan Milosevic to withdraw his forces without a ground invasion. These were all echoes of 1944, proof that the lessons learned in the skies over Germany still dictated how wars were fought half a century later. There was another more subtle legacy as well, one that spoke not to the tactics of war but to its morality. The oil campaign raised profound questions about the ethics of strategic bombing. If victory could be achieved by targeting infrastructure rather than people, did that make war more humane? Or did it simply shift the suffering from soldiers to civilians who bore the brunt of economic collapse and deprivation? The Allies had justified the bombing of Germany's fuel network on the grounds that it shortened the war and saved lives. And in many ways, they were right. The rapid collapse of the Wehrmacht after the fuel shortages arguably prevented months, perhaps years, of additional fighting. Yet the campaign also inflicted immense hardship on the German population. Factories closed, transport failed, and civilians froze in their homes. Tens of thousands died not from bombs directly, but from the consequences of a shattered industrial base. These questions would echo through every subsequent conflict. The debate over the morality of targeting infrastructure remains unresolved to this day. But one thing is certain. The oil campaign changed the way the world thought about the relationship between war, technology, and society. It proved that war could be waged not just against armies and governments, but against the very systems that sustained a nation's way of life. The Luftwaffe, for its part, never recovered from the humiliation. Once the most feared air force in the world, it emerged from the war a broken institution, its doctrines discredited, its arrogance punished, its legacy overshadowed by defeat. For decades after the war, German military planners studied the oil campaign with a mixture of regret and grudging respect. They recognized that their failure to anticipate and counter the strategic bombing threat had been one of the decisive factors in their downfall, and they vowed never to underestimate the power of air strategy again. But the ultimate irony remained. The Luftwaffe had been right about one thing. Precision bombing was a fantasy in the 1930s. It was impossible until it wasn't. The Americans had taken an idea the Germans mocked as naive and turned it into the most powerful weapon of the war. The very concept the Luftwaffe had dismissed as a joke became the instrument of their destruction. Behind every bomb that fell on Germany's synthetic fuel plants was a human story, a story of courage, fear, sacrifice, and relentless determination. It's easy to speak of precision bombing in terms of technology and strategy, but the reality was far more brutal. Those surgical strikes were carried out by young men flying thousands of miles over hostile territory, through skies filled with flak and fighters, knowing that many would never return. The crews of the 8th Air Force lived on the razor's edge. A typical bombing mission to central Germany could last 8 to 10 hours, with most of it spent in freezing temperatures at 20,000 feet. Frostbite was common. Oxygen systems froze, engines failed, and all the while, black bursts of flak erupted around them, shrapnel tearing through metal and flesh alike. German fighters darted in and out of formation, spraying cannon fire into the lumbering bombers. For many crews, survival wasn't a question of skill. It was a matter of luck. The casualty rates were staggering. In 1943, before long-range escorts like the P-51 Mustang arrived, bomber losses regularly exceeded 20% on deep penetration missions. A crew's chances of surviving a 25-mission tour, the benchmark for rotation home, were less than 30%. Every time the crews climbed into their planes, they were playing Russian roulette with the flak guns of the Reich. And yet, they kept going. Why? Because they believed in the mission. They believed that what they were doing could shorten the war and save lives. They believed that if they could destroy Germany's ability to make war, they could end the slaughter on the ground. And slowly, painfully, they were proven right. One of the most remarkable aspects of the oil campaign was the sheer scale of intelligence and coordination required. Precision bombing wasn't just about hitting a target, it was about finding it. Reconnaissance flights mapped every square mile of German industry, identifying critical components of each plant. Hydrogenation towers, catalyst chambers, cracking units, storage tanks. Analysts pored over aerial photographs, drawing up detailed plans that showed bomber crews exactly where to aim. Even the timing of the raids was calculated with surgical precision. Weather reports, wind forecasts, and even sun angles were factored into mission planning. Pathfinder aircraft, equipped with radar and navigation aids far more advanced than anything else in the air, flew ahead of the main formations, marking targets with flares even through thick clouds. The complexity was staggering. A single raid on a major fuel plant could involve hundreds of bombers, dozens of escorts, multiple Pathfinders, and countless support aircraft. This fusion of intelligence, technology, and tactics was unprecedented. It transformed bombing from a blunt instrument into a true strategic weapon, and it turned the men who planned and executed those missions into something more than just soldiers. They were engineers of destruction, orchestrating attacks that targeted the very lifeblood of the enemy's war effort. On the other side of the bomb bay doors, the human story was just as powerful, and often far more tragic. For German civilians, the bombing campaign was a nightmare that seemed to have no end. Entire towns were built around synthetic fuel plants, and when those plants became targets, so did the people who lived nearby. Workers who had once labored to support the war effort now found themselves digging through rubble for survivors. Families huddled in air raid shelters as the sky above them erupted in fire. Children were evacuated to the countryside, only to return months later to find their homes reduced to ashes. The Nazi regime, desperate to maintain morale, portrayed the bombings as proof of Allied barbarism. Propaganda posters showed women and children killed by terror flyers, and urged civilians to fight on. But as the raids intensified and the devastation mounted, even the most fervent believers began to lose faith. The idea of Nazi invincibility, so carefully cultivated by Joseph Goebbels, collapsed under the weight of reality. The Reich could no longer protect its people. And yet, amid the ruins, something unexpected happened. Many civilians, rather than turning against the regime, directed their anger inward, not at the bombers above, but at the leaders who had led them into a war they could no longer win. Morale didn't just break, it rotted from within. Factories struggled with absenteeism. Resistance networks found new recruits. Desertions in the Wehrmacht increased. The bombing campaign, by destroying not only Germany's capacity to fight but also its will to continue, was achieving results far beyond the physical damage. The men on the ground, German soldiers, engineers, and civilians alike, often spoke of the bombing campaign with a mix of awe and terror. They described the sky turning black with bombers, the ground shaking as thousands of tons of explosives detonated, and the eerie silence that followed when the smoke cleared, and they realized their world had changed forever. Some engineers tried desperately to repair the damage, working day and night to patch pipelines and rebuild towers, but their efforts were often in vain. A plant that had taken years to construct could be crippled again in a single raid. The cycle became endless. Repair, bomb, repair, bomb. Until eventually, there was nothing left to repair. German soldiers tasked with defending these facilities felt the futility even more keenly. They manned flak guns, fired thousands of rounds, and watched bombers fall from the sky, only to see hundreds more follow behind. Many came to dread the sound of distant engines, knowing that no matter how hard they fought, they could not stop the tide. It was like trying to hold back the ocean with a bucket, one flak gunner recalled after the war. The psychological warfare was as devastating as the physical. The Americans understood that every successful raid didn't just destroy a facility, it destroyed German confidence. Each time a fuel plant went up in flames, it reminded the Reich's leaders, its soldiers, and its citizens that their enemy could strike anywhere, anytime, and that nothing, not even the most vital arteries of the war effort, was beyond reach. The cumulative effect was enormous. By late 1944, many German commanders no longer believed victory was possible. They fought not for triumph, but for survival, hoping only to delay the inevitable. Civilian faith in the regime plummeted. Even Hitler's inner circle began preparing for the end, hoarding fuel, food, and gold for the chaos they knew was coming. It is easy, decades later, to view the oil campaign as a purely technical achievement, a triumph of engineering and tactics. But its true impact was deeper, more profound. It broke Germany's spirit. It shattered the illusion of invincibility. And it proved that a war could be won not by conquering cities or defeating armies, but by dismantling the machinery that sustained them, piece by piece, bomb by bomb. By the final months of the war, the psychological collapse of Germany was almost as complete as its physical destruction. The Reich that had once believed itself destined to rule Europe now found itself trapped, strangled, and bleeding out under the weight of its own hubris. The sound of Allied bombers overhead, once a cause for mockery, had become the soundtrack of defeat. Each formation that appeared in the sky was another reminder that the industrial heart of the nation no longer belonged to Germany. It belonged to the enemy. In cities once untouched by war, the devastation was now total. Leuna, Berlin, Perlitz, names that had once symbolized industrial strength, were now synonymous with smoking ruins and twisted steel. Entire communities had been built around these plants. Their workers were the lifeblood of the Reich's war economy, their products the fuel that powered Hitler's armies. And now, they were gone. The destruction rippled outward in ways few had predicted. Without synthetic fuel, Germany's vast logistical network collapsed. Rail lines fell silent as locomotives sat idle. Inland shipping routes were abandoned as barges went nowhere. Even the humble bicycle became a precious commodity, as fuel shortages rendered vehicles useless. It wasn't just the military that was paralyzed. It was society itself. Daily life became a struggle for survival. In Berlin, civilians queued for hours for meager rations. Coal shortages left entire neighborhoods freezing through the winter of 1944-45. Black markets flourished, trading stolen fuel and food at prices ordinary citizens could never afford. Rumors of defeat spread like wildfire, despite the Gestapo's brutal attempts to silence them. By spring, the population had grown numb to the constant air raids. The howl of sirens no longer inspired panic. It was simply part of life, as inevitable as the sunrise. The Wehrmacht, too, was in a state of terminal decline. Once mighty divisions existed now only on paper. Entire armies had been reduced to scattered, under-equipped battalions. Fuel shortages meant that strategic redeployments, once a key strength of German military doctrine, were impossible. Reinforcements arrived too late, or not at all. Retreats turned into routes. Commanders begged for resources that no longer existed. One of the most symbolic examples of this collapse occurred in the closing weeks of the war. In a desperate bid to slow the Soviet advance, Hitler ordered armored units to mount a counteroffensive near the Oder River. On paper, the plan called for hundreds of tanks to strike the Red Army's flanks. In reality, fewer than 50 could be fueled. Of those, many broke down en route. The offensive never materialized, not because of enemy action, but because the fuel to launch it simply didn't exist. It was a grim irony. The Wehrmacht had been built on the principles of speed and maneuver, lightning war, mechanized mobility, the ruthless exploitation of weakness. But without fuel, those principles were worthless. German tanks became steel coffins, trucks became scrap metal. The mechanized juggernaut that had conquered half of Europe was now a static, exhausted force, clinging desperately to the last scraps of territory. The Luftwaffe's situation was even worse. With aviation fuel production virtually non-existent, many aircraft never left the ground. Pilots were ordered to conserve fuel by limiting training flights to a few minutes. New squadrons were formed with barely enough fuel for a single combat mission. When the Allies launched their final bombing raids in early 1945, many air bases didn't even scramble fighters. They had nothing left to fly. The once proud Air Force that had terrorized London and Stalingrad had been reduced to impotence. For many German soldiers, the end of the war was not marked by a dramatic final battle, but by the slow realization that they were fighting a war that no longer existed. Some units surrendered without firing a shot. Others disintegrated, entirely, their men deserting or simply walking home. The will to fight, so ferocious in 1939 and 1940, had evaporated. What remained was exhaustion, resignation, and the desperate hope of surviving long enough to see peace. The collapse of the fuel supply also eroded the regime's ideological grip on the population. Hitler's promises of victory and vengeance rang hollow when trains didn't run, when factories stood silent, when even the most basic necessities became luxuries. The once iron grip of the Nazi state weakened as the reality of defeat became undeniable. Local officials ignored orders from Berlin, civilians refused to evacuate as directed. Some even welcomed the advancing Allies, believing anything was better than continued suffering under a regime that could no longer protect them. Inside Hitler's bunker, the mood was equally bleak. Reports from the front grew worse by the day. Supply depots were empty. Entire divisions had ceased to exist. The last reserves of aviation fuel were hoarded for a few remaining transport flights and emergency evacuations. Hitler raged at his generals, accusing them of betrayal, but deep down, he knew the truth. The war had been lost the moment the Allies took control of the skies and began dismantling the Reich's industrial heart. When the Soviet army entered Berlin in April 1945, they found a city on the verge of total collapse. There was little organized resistance. The once mighty German war machine was a shadow of itself, incapable of launching counterattacks or sustaining defenses. The battle for Berlin, once envisioned as the climactic showdown of the war, was instead a brutal, inevitable slog through a broken city defended by children, old men, and scattered remnants of exhausted units. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, but in a sense, Germany's defeat had been sealed months earlier, not on the battlefield, not in the ruins of Berlin, but in the skies over Leuna and Pölitz. The bombs that fell there did not just destroy fuel plants. They destroyed the Wehrmacht's mobility, the Luftwaffe's reach, the Reich's economy, and the Nazi regime's ability to sustain a war. They turned Hitler's vision of a 1,000-year empire into a 100-day countdown. The oil campaign proved that wars are not won solely by armies clashing in the field. They are won by cutting off the arteries that feed those armies, by denying them the resources they need to fight. The Luftwaffe's arrogance had blinded Germany to that reality. The Americans had understood it from the start, and once they learned how to strike with precision, the outcome was inevitable. In the aftermath of the war, Allied commanders reflected on the lessons of the oil campaign with a mixture of pride and regret. Pride because it had demonstrated the power of strategic bombing and helped bring about victory. Regret because it had taken so long to realize where Germany's true vulnerability lay. Many historians believe that if the Allies had focused on synthetic fuel from the beginning, the war might have ended a year earlier, saving millions of lives. But even with that hindsight, the campaign remains one of the most brilliant and consequential operations in military history. It was a triumph not just of air power, but of intelligence, technology, and strategic thinking. It was proof that war could be fought and won with precision, and it was the ultimate vindication of an idea once dismissed as a fantasy. The end of the war did not bring immediate peace, at least not in the minds of those who had lived through the devastation. Germany was not just a defeated nation, it was a shattered one. Its cities lay in ruins, its industries obliterated, its people starving and displaced. The mighty industrial empire that had once fueled the Nazi war machine was now a landscape of twisted metal and broken concrete. And at the heart of that destruction were the synthetic fuel plants, the very sites that had once powered the Reich's ambitions. Allied occupation forces quickly moved to assess the damage. Teams of engineers, scientists, and military analysts toured the wreckage of Leuna, Berlin, and countless other industrial complexes. What they found astonished them. The precision and effectiveness of the bombing campaign had far exceeded their expectations. In some cases, a handful of bombs had caused catastrophic chain reactions, rendering massive facilities useless. Entire plants that had taken years to build had been knocked offline in a single afternoon. These discoveries had profound implications for the post-war world. The Allies understood now that industrial vulnerability was not just a military concern, it was a geopolitical one. Any future war would almost certainly involve similar attacks on critical infrastructure. As the Cold War began to take shape, the lessons of 1944 became foundational to military planning on both sides of the Iron Curtain. The United States and the Soviet Union poured vast resources into hardening their industries, dispersing critical facilities, and building redundant systems that could survive a sustained bombing campaign. The occupation authorities also saw an opportunity for reconstruction, not just of Germany's infrastructure, but of its society. The Marshall Plan, launched in 1948, aimed to rebuild Europe's shattered economies, including Germany's, and to prevent the rise of extremism by ensuring economic stability. But the Allies were careful about what they rebuilt. The synthetic fuel plants, symbols of Germany's war machine, were largely dismantled or repurposed for civilian use. Never again would they be allowed to serve as the backbone of a militarized economy. The human toll of the bombing campaign, however, lingered long after the last bomb fell. Millions of Germans were displaced, their homes destroyed, and their cities unrecognizable. The psychological scars ran deep. Many who had survived the raids described lifelong trauma, the sound of sirens triggering panic decades later, the sight of contrails in the sky rekindling old fears. Children who had grown up in the shadow of the bombers carried those memories into adulthood, shaping their attitudes toward war, technology, and even their nation's place in the world. For Allied airmen, too, the legacy was complicated. They were hailed as heroes, credited with shortening the war and saving countless lives. But many struggled with the weight of what they had done. Some spoke of vivid memories, watching their bombs hit their targets and knowing that people were dying below. Others questioned whether the destruction they had unleashed had been necessary, or whether it could have been achieved with less suffering. The debates over the morality of strategic bombing intensified in the years after the war. Critics argued that the raids had caused disproportionate civilian casualties and inflicted unnecessary suffering. Supporters countered that the campaign had hastened the end of the war and ultimately saved lives by preventing prolonged fighting. These debates would shape public opinion and military ethics for decades to come. They continue even today, influencing how nations justify the use of air power in modern conflicts. Yet even amid the moral ambiguity, one fact remained undeniable. The oil campaign had fundamentally changed the way wars were fought and the way peace was kept. The atomic bomb may have ended the war in the Pacific, but it was precision bombing that ended Germany's capacity to fight. It was a quieter, more methodical form of warfare, one that attacked not soldiers or cities, but the systems that sustained them. And in doing so, it set the template for the wars of the future. The new geopolitical order that emerged after 1945 was built on this understanding. The United States, now the preeminent superpower, organized its entire military doctrine around the concept of strategic precision. The newly formed U.S. Air Force became the centerpiece of deterrence, tasked with the capability to strike any enemy's vital infrastructure, nuclear or otherwise, anywhere in the world. The Soviet Union, recognizing the same truth, invested heavily in both offensive bombing capabilities and defensive systems to protect its own industrial base. The result was a tense, precarious balance. Both sides knew that their greatest vulnerability lay not in their armies but in their infrastructure, their fuel supplies, their power grids, their communications networks. This mutual understanding formed the backbone of Cold War deterrence. The knowledge that neither side could survive a precision strike against its vital systems kept both from launching a war in the first place. For Germany, the post-war decades were a period of reckoning and rebuilding. The nation that had once prided itself on its technological and industrial prowess now faced the monumental task of starting over. The Marshall Plan fueled rapid reconstruction, and by the 1950s, West Germany had become an economic powerhouse once again. But its industrial base was now firmly under civilian control, its military ambitions strictly limited by treaty. The lesson of the oil campaign, that industrial might could be both a nation's greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability, was not forgotten. The Federal Republic of Germany embraced a new identity, one built not on conquest, but on commerce. Its industries shifted from producing tanks and synthetic fuel to producing cars, chemicals, and consumer goods. The same engineering expertise that had once fueled war now powered peace, and perhaps most importantly, Germany became one of the world's most vocal advocates for diplomacy, cooperation, and European integration, a deliberate rejection of the militarism that had led it to ruin. Even the old synthetic fuel plants found new life. Some were rebuilt as petrochemical facilities, others converted into research centers or repurposed for civilian energy production. They became symbols of a new Germany, one that remembered the past but was determined not to repeat it. The story of the oil campaign also shaped how historians and strategists understood World War II itself. For decades, the popular narrative had focused on dramatic battles, Stalingrad, Normandy, El Alamein, as the turning points of the war. But as more archival material became available and the full impact of the bombing campaign was understood, scholars began to argue that the true turning point had come not on the battlefield, but in the skies above Germany's industrial heartland. The destruction of the synthetic fuel network, they argued, was the moment the Reich's fate was sealed. It didn't happen overnight. It wasn't marked by a single decisive battle, but once the bombs began falling with precision, Germany's defeat became inevitable. The tanks would stop rolling, the planes would stop flying, the factories would stop producing. The 1,000-year Reich would collapse, not with a bang, but with the slow, relentless strangulation of its fuel supply.